Anna Scott here. Welcome back to the Anna Scott channel. Before we step into today's narration, take a moment to subscribe if you like calm, story-driven breakdowns of high-stakes conflict and strategy. It's a small click that makes a huge difference for this channel. And as you listen, leave a comment, mon Dieu, with your take, because I read them, and your ideas often guide what I narrate next. Now, let's begin. Most of the people we once had in mind are dead. Not retired, not out of the game, dead. In the kind of war depicted in this story, losses don't arrive politely. They arrive in sudden silences, in emptied offices, in radios that go quiet mid-sentence, in chains of command that abruptly end with no one left to answer. Names that used to fill briefings become blanks, faces that used to appear on screens become dust. And war, real or fictional, has its own ruthless, highly consistent logic. When a power feels cornered, it doesn't always charge the strongest wall. If it can't inflict meaningful damage on its opponent's main force, it turns its attention to something else, something softer, something more delicate, something that the opponent values too much to risk. It turns its attention to the opponent's wealthiest allies, its most vulnerable partners, its most fragile points of confidence. In military literature, we call that asymmetric blackmail. Not a straight contest of strength, but a threat designed to poison the environment around the enemy. A message that says, if you won't bleed where I want you to bleed, then everyone around you will. And here's why that method is so effective. Because it forces decision makers to defend everything at once, not just ships and bases, but ports, markets, insurance networks, shipping lanes, and the public mood. It turns a war of firepower into a war of nerves. Just days earlier in the narrative, people were gathered around a table, examining maps like surgeons studying anatomy. The United States struck Hark Island, portrayed here as Iran's oil lifeline. B-2 bombers sealed off underground cities. 16 mine-laying ships were hunted and sunk, and in the aftermath of those moves, the room didn't celebrate. It waited. Because in wars like this, every decisive strike invites a desperate answer. Everyone in the story could feel the next move approaching, even before it had a name. Then the weekend arrived, and Tehran made the move that sent shockwaves across the entire Middle East. Because the target was no longer just American warships. The target became the United Arab Emirates. Let's sit with that. In this story, the UAE is not simply an ally, it is a symbol, a country built on the promise of safety, a global junction where capital flows, quiet, continuous, enormous, a place whose skyline is not merely architecture, but a billboard that says, stability lives here. And stability in the modern world is not only protected by soldiers, it's protected by belief, by the assumption that business will open tomorrow, that flights will land, that the port will load, that banks will function, that the lights won't flicker. So when the war reaches the UAE, it isn't only a military expansion, it is an attack on the idea of insulation. In the narrative, the war reaches Dubai's borders, and the tone shifts immediately. It's no longer only ships and sea lanes, it's ports, financial arteries, and the fragile psychology of markets. At the same time, political shockwaves rise. Headlines within this fictional scenario flash with an unnerving claim. President Donald Trump tells NBC News that Iran's new supreme leader may not be alive. Then another leak follows. Intelligence from Washington suggests Iran's top leadership, its command and control mechanism, has been wiped off the map. That is why the campaign in this story is given a name meant to sound definitive: Operation Epic Fury. Because what's being described isn't pressure, it's decapitation, and now the map changes. The war moves from seas and descends into skyscrapers. So we walk through the breaking point of March 14th to 15th as portrayed here. Iran's retaliatory attacks broaden. The focus shifts from direct U.S. assets to U.S. partners across West Asia, and the UAE becomes the stress test. Reports in the storyline describe a drone attack, unmanned aerial vehicles moving toward Fujairah port, one of the UAE's most critical energy and logistics hubs. Fujairah matters because of what it represents. It is an interface between raw material and global movement. It is where fuel meets ships, where shipping lanes become schedules, where commerce becomes something physical. In the story, American and Emirati air defense systems respond, Patriot and THAAD batteries forming the umbrella. They manage to intercept the drones in midair. But interception is not the same thing as safety, because a drone that doesn't reach its intended target can still become a weapon when it breaks apart. Shrapnel falls, oil facilities ignite, massive fires erupt, logistical operations are halted, the port's rhythm, so precise, so profitable, stutters. And then the second-order effects begin. Not explosions, but questions that never need to be spoken out loud. Shipping insurers quietly revisit risk. Operators pause routes temporarily while everyone waits to see whether the next wave comes. Companies begin rerouting cargo, not because the port is destroyed, but because the port is no longer predictable. That is the hidden damage of asymmetric blackmail. It doesn't need to flatten a city. It only needs to introduce uncertainty. This is the geopolitical significance in the clearest possible terms. The UAE, Dubai, and Abu Dhabi functions here as the Middle East's safe haven opening to the West, the heartland of billionaires, massive funds, and global maritime trade. So every missile aimed at this space does not merely threaten infrastructure. It threatens the illusion of security. And in a world of finance, an illusion is a load-bearing structure. It holds up confidence. It holds up investment. It holds up the idea that money can sleep. The storyline gives us numbers to underline scale. Figures attributed to the UAE Ministry of Defense describe a barrage since the conflict began: 294 ballistic missiles, 15 cruise missiles, more than 1,600 suicide drones, and in the latest attack alone, 9 ballistic missiles and 33 drones. There is an implied conclusion in those numbers. If it were not for the American air defense umbrella over the UAE, this story suggests we would be witnessing piles of rubble where glittering towers now stand. The narrative then turns to motive. Not motive in the emotional sense, motive in the strategic sense. It is presented as a claim, a pretext, a justification that sounds operational but behaves like psychological warfare. Iran's leadership insists it did not target the UAE without reason. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, as portrayed here, makes a startling allegation. He claims that when American warplanes struck Hark Island, they did not launch from aircraft carriers. He claims they launched from secret ports and bases inside the UAE, specifically near Ras Al Khaimah and Dubai. And then the claim becomes a threat. An evacuation order is issued, a warning directed openly at people outside Iran's borders. Stay away from American bases and ports, the message says. Strikes are coming. Now, pause. Because this is where strategic analysis matters. In this scenario, the United States possesses enormous floating fortresses, aircraft carriers capable of launching strikes from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. It has strategic bases in allied territories. It has deep logistical reach, and it has the massive Al Udeid base in Qatar. So the story's logic makes one point clear. Washington does not technically need to hide behind civilian ports in Dubai to strike an oil hub. Which brings us to the purpose of the allegation. Not engineering, intimidation. If Iran cannot match the U.S. military on the battlefield, it seeks to intimidate America's allies. It targets the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, not necessarily to defeat them outright, but to frighten them into changing their calculus. It aims to drive the UAE into panic, to push the government toward a desperate internal debate. Is hosting American forces worth it if the nation becomes the battlefield? This is asymmetric blackmail translated into state behavior, the mafia movie logic of, if you harbor the police, your shop burns, except the shop is a port, and the fire is missile debris. In the storyline, the UAE does not yield. A senior advisor, Anwar Gargash, signals resolve and composure. The message is restrained. They have the right to defend themselves. They will act with reason and logic. But the narrative warns us not to mistake Iran's aggression for simple anger. Because beneath the barrage, there is another force. A structural collapse, a military system losing its spine. Earlier in Operation Epic Fury, as portrayed here, American aircraft neutralize Iran's top figure, the supreme leader. with precision strikes. And then, over the weekend, President Trump claims new intelligence. The replacement leader, Mojtaba, may be dead as well, and the entire command structure may have been wiped off the map in the latest precision strikes. In the story, Trump's language becomes its own kind of weapon. He describes Hark Island as completely destroyed. Then he adds, with a tone that feels almost mocking, that it could be struck again, just for fun. In a narrative like this, that phrase is not just bravado, it signals a battlefield reality. When a superpower speaks that way mid-conflict, it implies the opponent's air defense network has been neutralized, its command structure has collapsed, and American aircraft can operate in Iranian airspace with the confidence of ownership. Now imagine the aftermath on the Iranian side. A leaderless apparatus, a command chain severed, a military arm, especially the IRGC, left without a central strategy. In the storyline, what follows is a scattershot pattern. Missiles and drones launched in multiple directions toward the UAE and Bahrain. Bahrain, in this scenario, reportedly intercepts 125 missiles in recent days. And instead of careful targeting that serves a coherent goal, the attacks begin to resemble a reflex, fight or flight, a desperate system lashing outward to prove it still exists. Yet even a desperate force can still be deadly. Desperation removes restraint. It makes the dangerous option feel reasonable. It makes escalation feel like survival. That is why the United States in this story refuses to gamble on the enemy's exhaustion. It moves to make control absolute. Earlier in the narrative, we hear of carrier deployments already in motion. USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Gerald R. Ford positioned to project power. Now, to crush swarm tactics, small boats, suicide drones, unpredictable saturation, the Pentagon deploys another behemoth into the theater, USS George H.W. Bush, CVN-77. This ship is framed here as more than a warship, a 100,000-ton nuclear-powered floating airbase, more firepower than the air force of an entire country, over 56 fighter jets, nearly 15 heavy attack and anti-submarine helicopters. So why bring a second massive carrier element when one is already present? In this dramatized breakdown, the answer is mission sharing, division of roles, sword and shield. USS Abraham Lincoln continues deep operations. F-35 stealth fighters pressing inward, strikes designed to blind missile silos in the mountains, to knock out air defense radars, to collapse the enemy's ability to coordinate. It is the sword. The newly arrived USS George H.W. Bush takes on the shield, sealing off the skies over the Gulf, detecting and destroying suicide drones, countering speedboat swarms aimed at the UAE or commercial vessels. The narrative highlights a crucial component of modern dominance, electronic warfare, EA-18G Growler aircraft, not just bombs and missiles, but the control of signals, the interruption of guidance, the stripping of coordination. Because in a conflict like this, destroying hardware is only half the battle. The other half is collapsing the enemy's ability to see, to aim, to synchronize, to decide. And when Fleet Command announces that the ship's intensive training is complete and it is ready to strike targets with flawless precision, the statement functions like a cold breath against the back of the neck, because it implies readiness, it implies time, it implies that the machine is not tired. In the language of this story, America doesn't just take air superiority, it establishes air hegemony. Now, as we move deeper, the conflict expands beyond what anyone can comfortably call contained. This is no longer merely a US-Iran conflict. It becomes a regional ignition attempt. Over March 15th to 16th in the storyline, Iran-backed militias try to set not just the Gulf, but multiple fronts ablaze. In Baghdad, the U.S. Embassy building comes under heavy attack at midnight. Washington issues an urgent alert instructing American citizens to leave Iraq immediately. Meanwhile, Israel operates its defense systems at full capacity. Interceptors rise, incoming missiles are tracked, explosions are heard in the skies over Jerusalem. In the logic of escalation, this is what pressure looks like, not one strike, many points of strain, a network of threats designed to stretch defenses thin, to exhaust attention, to force mistakes. Then the narrative drops numbers like a ledger. Independent open source intelligence data, OSINT, within the story suggests, since the war's start on February 28th, over 6,000 Iranian military personnel have been killed, Over 190 ballistic missile launchers have been destroyed, including those placed inside mountainous terrain. Over 90 Iranian naval vessels have been sunk. These figures are not simply a toll. In a story like this, they become a record of anatomical disintegration. A military losing its organs one by one, a force that can still lash out, but may no longer be able to think. And that brings us to the heart of this narrative's closing thought. In the last 24 hours of this storyline, Iran, its leadership cadre crushed, its oil revenues reduced to ash on Hark Island, its navy sunk toward the ocean floor, tries to drag the world down with it. Not by defeating the United States in a direct clash, but by shifting the war toward the financial hubs that keep the region alive. Because when you cannot beat a superpower's military, you try to destabilize its ecosystem. You threaten the allies, you threaten the ports, you threaten the places where capital sleeps. It is war as intimidation, war as hostage-taking, war as a demand for attention, and notice the cruel elegance of the move. A missile aimed at a warship is a military act. A drone aimed at a financial hub is a political act, an economic act, and a psychological act at the same time. It forces boardrooms to meet. It forces governments to reassure. It forces citizens to wonder, and it forces allies to make promises out loud. But in this narrative, the United States signals it will not yield. Backed by aircraft carriers, B-2 bombers, and enormous logistical depth, Washington lays out a doctrine that sounds brutally simple. Not, "I'll keep defending forever," but "I'll remove your ability to threaten." A doctrine that translates to, "I won't bother shielding every target you choose. I'll destroy the hand that keeps throwing the knife." And now we arrive at the point where the next chapter depends on choices, on fear, on alliances, on whether states believe protection is stronger than silence. So I want to leave you with two questions. Only two, but they matter. And I want you to answer them in the comments because your answers will shape the direction of our next narration. First question. If financial hubs like the UAE are struck or threatened directly, do Gulf states move closer to the United States for protection? Or do they back down out of fear, hoping distance will buy them safety? Second question. If an army is deprived of leadership and its command structure is severed, how much longer can it fight before its attacks stop being strategy and become nothing but chaos? Share your most thoughtful analysis below. If you disagree with other comments, challenge them respectfully, but don't hold back your reasoning. This channel is at its best when the comments section becomes a strategy room. And if you want YouTube to keep recommending this kind of long-form narration, subscribe to the Anna Scott channel and leave a comment. Those two actions tell the algorithm that this isn't background noise. This is something worth pushing. Anna Scott, signing off for now. I'll see you in the next chapter.